Hello and welcome to another episode of TV on TV. I'm State Representative Tommy Vitolo. You're watching Brookline Interactive Group. Today is Thursday, November 18th, 1 week from Thanksgiving. And I'm thankful for the guest today. Jeff Speck is a Brookline resident and an international sensation. He helps communities, cities, counties, sometimes neighborhoods figure out what the street design should be, what the neighborhood design should be, how buildings should interface. He thinks about the urban landscape and how to make it work for people. Absolutely phenomenal and fascinating guest. That interview is pre-recorded, so we're going to cut to it in a few minutes. But first, the news. After months of negotiation, President Biden signed into law the bipartisan infrastructure bill, which will invest $1 trillion in roads, bridges, climate change initiatives, and more across the country. The Biden administration is also devising a multi-billion-dollar plan to increase the supply of vaccine doses in other nations. Today, the two men convicted of the murder of Malcolm X have been exonerated following a 22-month investigation by the Manhattan District Attorney. This morning, the Baker-Polito administration authorized the Pfizer vaccine booster shot for all adults over the age of 18. Visit the VaxFinder tool at vaxfinder.mass.gov, that's vaxfinder.mass.gov, for a full list of locations to receive a booster. On Tuesday, the Massachusetts House of Representatives passed the Genocide Education Bill. This legislation requires every school district in the Commonwealth to incorporate genocide education into their curriculum. This bill also establishes a genocide education trust fund, funded in part by fines imposed for hate crimes and civil rights violations, to develop curriculum and train educators. The bill has already passed the Senate and is expected to head to the governor's desk shortly. Given the recent rise in anti-Semitism and the recent realization that many people in America really don't know much at all about the Holocaust, and the incredible tragedy therein, I was especially delighted to support this bill and glad that we finally were able to move it forward. Yesterday, the House of Representatives, myself included, passed a healthcare consolidation bill that strengthens protections for community hospitals against larger provider expansions into their service area and expands the definition of underserved and underrepresented populations. The bill now moves to the Senate. Yesterday, we in the House also approved new congressional and governor's council maps, which now go to the governor's desk. On Tuesday of this week, my good friend, Michelle Wu, was sworn in as mayor of Boston. Wu is the first woman and first person of color to be elected mayor in Boston's 300-year history. Since her swearing in, Mayor Wu has announced that the city will halt the removal of unhoused people at Mass and Cass. This comes after the ACLU sued the city for violating the property rights of displaced dwellers. The Brookline Housing Authority, BHA, was awarded 20 VASH vouchers. Those are the vouchers that serve formerly unhoused veterans. This award comes directly from the Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD. Brookline's First Light ceremony, First Light holiday celebration, I think is a better phrase, will be held this Saturday, November 20th. Businesses will be open from 2 to 5 p.m. and the Chamber of Commerce will host an event from 4 to 5 p.m. at the Florida Ruffin Ridley School. That's it for the news. We're going to kick it right over to our interview with Jeff Speck, filmed just a bit earlier, last week, in fact. And I'm sure you're going to find it fascinating. And stay tuned. You're watching Brookline Interactive Group. And as promised here on Brookline Interactive Group, we've got my friend and yours, Jeff Speck. Jeff, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Tommy. It's so nice to talk to you. Doesn't happen as often as I would like.
Now listen, a lot of the folks on the show are elected or otherwise sort of in the front of people's minds. And you've been working in the background. So who the heck are you, and what have you been up to for the last, 60 odd years?
Yeah, almost 60 years, but I haven't been working that whole time. I'm a city planner. I'm based in Brookline. I grew up in Belmont and left this fair state for my first real gig in my profession at age 30, where I spent 10 years in Miami with the folks that inspired me, which was kind of the foundational new urbanists. So when I was in college, and then later on, I learned about the work of these folks who had basically realized that we've been planning America wrong for about 50 years, led by Andres Duany and Elizabeth Plater-Zyberk, who eventually teamed up with a bunch of other people to create this whole new urbanism movement around alternatives to suburban sprawl, around reinvesting in our city centers, and essentially getting us back and hopefully beyond the quality of design that we were looking at in our communities a century ago. So I was trained as an architect and thought I'd become an architect, but when I saw the work of these folks back in the 80s, I was like, wow, design can have such a greater impact on society and on the quality of life. And if we design better places, we can save lives and we can have more productive lives. And so I spent a decade in Miami with my mentors, and then actually was appointed to the National Endowment for the Arts in 2003, where I served 4 years as design director. Subsequent to that, I started my own firm. So from 2007 on, first in Washington, D.C., and then starting 8 years ago here in Brookline, I've had my small firm called Speck and Associates, where I do projects for cities. I do downtown master plans, I do waterfront studies, I do urban infill plans. I also do projects for developers, mostly or almost entirely new town work. So it has to be mixed use, walkable, not auto-centric development. And while doing all of this, I took good notes. So the other part of my career has been writing about urban design. So I was so inspired by Andres Duany and Elizabeth Plater-Zyberk that I wrote a book with them, or convinced them to let me write a book for them and then with them, that came out in 2000 called Suburban Nation. And Suburban Nation was probably the best-selling planning book of that decade. And it basically told this story about why we love older places, why we love traditional neighborhoods, why we love villages, towns, cities, and why we hate sprawl, and how sprawl is actually the only thing that's legal. And if we want to build more great places, we need to change the laws. And of course, that's been a huge part of our work. And then in 2012, my own book, Walkable City, came out. And Walkable City was a reaction to the last decade that I'd spent working largely with mayors in downtowns, trying to make downtowns more viable. On your prompt, I've put my books in front of me. So here's Walkable City. You'll notice the subtitle is How Downtown Can Save America One Step at a Time. And that is the idea of the book. And that was the best-selling book of its decade in planning. And I have a follow-up, and I only mention it for your audience because this is the book that cities use, that people in cities use to convince other people to care about making their cities more walkable and more livable, and to do a better job of it. But it's really kind of like a gateway drug for people who want to get excited about this stuff, or actually are excited about it, but don't know that much about it, or want to teach other people about how our cities can be better planned. But if you're actually doing the work, I came out a couple of years ago with this follow-up book called Walkable City Rules. We had a wonderful reading party in the Brookline Booksmith when that came out a couple of years ago. And this is a book actually filled with details, techniques, diagrams, photographs, and actually it's 101 rules, and each rule is carefully illustrated and described. Like, don't have sharrows. Sharrows actually are more dangerous than nothing at all in your as a bicycle marking. So it's full of details like that. So that's my whole story. Sorry it took so long, but basically doing city planning, writing about city planning, working with developers and mayors, and of course, city councilors and others including some folks in state houses. Early on, I was able to help the folks in Pennsylvania write ordinances that allowed for mixed use development, for example. So there are some states that have been active in doing what they can, state representatives who are doing what they can to at least create a enabling framework for better design in individual communities.
And we know Pennsylvania needs all the help they can get. I got so many questions and so many ways we can go with it, but one thing that I think Brookline is grappling with, and other communities, Boston and surrounding communities in this metro area and other metro areas, there's a tension, I think, in urbanism, and it relates to a couple of different things you said. You point out that we love downtown areas, we love walkable areas. As people, they're the places we want to be. And you mentioned, I don't remember the exact words, but sort of there's not just a convenience to it, there's an aesthetic beauty to it. And there's no question that that's true, and that there's this human scale to downtown areas where the buildings aren't, 300 yards long, right? They tend to be smaller, and there's the facades are mixing it up, and it keeps it interesting. And I think all of that's true. And I also think that urban areas are just really convenient for modern living, right? Regardless of the aesthetic of it, like that I can flip my son a $20 bill and he can walk to Couples and get a dozen bagels on a Saturday or Sunday morning is really solid because he's 11, right? And
we do that. We just send our 13-year-old to Mamalas.
Yeah. So they pass as they walk by each other. But modern construction, many people don't find as beautiful as 100-year-old buildings, and whether or not they're right doesn't matter. How do we work through the tension of reinvigorating downtown areas with modern construction when, at least for some folks, what they love about it isn't going to be replicated?
Well, a lot of the work that I've done has been to try to accept but work with modern large infusions of capital, and yet somehow have an outcome which doesn't feel like that. So it's the reality of development practice in the US. And I work with some of these firms. I work with a $8 billion investment company that's building, $100 millions of dollars here and there and everywhere all around the US. The fact is that most real estate development is happening with these very large infusions of capital. So we've worked very hard over the years to try to create a framework that produces places that have variety, that have authenticity. Actually is I define loosely, I guess, define authenticity as variety within unity. So if you think about all the places that you love to visit, particularly globally, they feel authentic because actually there was a certain shared vocabulary. There was a certain common understanding based on climate, based on building materials, based on tradition that was inherited, but then lots of hands at work, right? And that feeling of energy of humanness that comes from having many different authors, but within a shared vocabulary or tradition, that creates an authentic place. And so just to give one little example, I worked on Riverside. So Riverside, we're turning a 1,000-car, 10-acre parking lot at the end of the Green Line into a 1 million+ square foot mixed-use development. It's for market development. I was the city planner. I'm still very involved on a day-to-day basis. Not only did I do the land plan, but with my colleagues, we created what's called a demise line diagram. And a demise line diagram takes these longer buildings, because if you're selling if you're renting 650 units of housing, those are going to be bigger buildings. It takes those buildings and actually artificially divides them up into what appears to be multiple buildings. And then we assign those facades to different architects, either in different firms, and there are a number of different architecture firms working at Riverside, or we ask the architects in their own firms to hand out the individual facades to different studios within their firms. And so you create this fiction, and it's a lie, which is what I was taught not to do in architecture school. But sometimes I say it's like a white lie. It's what you have to, sometimes you lie to make someone feel better, right? So here we've created a technique that allows these very large buildings to actually look and feel like smaller buildings. If you go to Assembly Row on that main square that looks out to the water, you'll see that technique at work. Elvis Manfredi did that job, and there's a building right there that looks like 3 buildings. So you use techniques like that. Obviously, the ideal is to not just break down the chunk of building, but to break down the chunk of investment and to create a code which is friendlier to smaller incremental developers. But unfortunately, these days, there aren't that many folks trying to develop buildings from that perspective compared to these large companies that are able to build big projects at once.
Now, in places like Brookline and in Boston, we have some amount of mass transit, of public transit, right? Folks can argue about whether or not it's good. It's all relative to experiences elsewhere, I suppose, but we certainly have it. And we have a tension going back probably, I guess, from the 50s and 60s, when urban renewal meant tear down buildings and build parking lots in their space. Where there are now sort of gaps in the fabric. And I'll give you a couple examples. I'll give you an old example and a new example, both in Coolidge Corner. The old example is the Center Street parking lot. That hasn't been a parking lot forever, right? 70 years ago, those were buildings, and we ripped them down to create parking. A more recent example is roughly right across from the Florida Rough and Ridley School is an imaging center. It's like you get CAT scans or something. And they have this parking lot out front, right along Harvard Street. It actually was originally built as a restaurant. And in both cases, it's a lousy place to walk by, but it allows people to get to the urban center to shop. And so how do we work through parking either on street or, in this case, really I'd like to talk about off-street parking, where we have choices on what could be in that land. How do we figure out what ought to be there?
So you've brought up 2 really good examples to compare and contrast. I would say one of them does the job well and one of them does it poorly. When you consolidate parking in one space within a downtown, it becomes an anchor. It becomes a receiver and a disgorger of pedestrians. So actually, in a driving community in which a lot of people get around in cars, not that we should encourage that, but in those sort of communities, those can contribute to the vitality of a downtown if they're hidden, if they're off the street, if they're behind the buildings, right? And while Center Street is no delight to walk on, it was never that significant of a pedestrian access. Everyone's walking on Harvard Street, which is fully protected by the fronts, or I should say fully energized and shaped and enlivened by the fronts of the buildings that give their doors directly to the sidewalk. And it's a wonderful walk until you get to that imaging center. And I gave a lecture in Princeton a few weeks ago, and they have this circumstance. Every downtown has it. Not every downtown, but most traditional downtowns have this experience. I remember just not that long ago, I was in Rhinebeck, New York. Same thing, beautiful Main Street. And the imaging center isn't that bad, but you're walking down that Main Street, you're feeling just so great and happy to walk. And then at a certain point in history, when it was thought to be good and the codes didn't stop it, someone plunked a parking lot in front of a building. And that parking lot in front of the building does so many things that are bad. It destroys the spatial definition of the street. And actually, we like our streets to be what we call outdoor living rooms. We don't feel comfortable. Evolutionary biologists tell us that all animals, humans included, were simultaneously seeking prospect and refuge. Prospect means you can see your predators before they get you, and refuge means that your flanks are covered from attack. And if your flanks don't feel covered, you actually don't feel comfortable. So when the building pulls back and it's 1 story tall and you lose that spatial definition behind the parking lot, it's no longer a comfortable space. Secondarily, of course, you've got the curb cut across the sidewalk. So the sidewalk is violated. It's actually a little dangerous because people may drive across it, and that's not a good thing. And then, of course, there's also the message that's this facility is not for locals. It's for people who are coming from any distance and driving in their cars. because it's been oriented around that longer distance driving commute. So there's so many things that these spaces do that are negative, but it's remarkable how town after town has them. And it's basically where you stop and turn around and don't want to keep walking.
Yeah, and in this case, it's frankly why JFK Crossing as a commercial area struggles, because when you're walking north on Harvard, if you're on the right side of the street, you get to FRR, a playground and a school, which is lovely. But if you're strolling for shopping, it's sort of the signal to turn around. And in fact, past that is some brownstone houses with very, very little commercial activity for a couple of blocks. On the other side of the street is housing, not mixed use, a religious institution, and then this imaging center, and it sends the same signal. So you get to the smoothie place on the left side of the street or the restaurant on the right side of the street, and you just turn around and you come back.
Yeah.
And I guess it's good to hear that that's true in other places too. I mean, not good, but reassuring that we're not the only.
And you started to talk about the T. I mean, I work in Utah, I work in Oklahoma City, I work in, all over. And people in Boston don't know how amazing the T is. I mean, it has its frustrations, but it grew up around a city that had such good bones to begin with, of course, as any of our cities prior to 1900 did. And then it is so, particularly the rail aspect of the T is so comprehensive in terms of the neighborhoods that it touches, that it really allows Boston to be one of very few cities in America where we can make, and by Boston, I mean the Boston area, where we can make the choice to not own a car or to own fewer cars or to just not be dependent on the car as a prosthetic device to satisfy our daily needs.
The need versus want, which I know you hear all the time, right? One person's need is another person. You need to drive? Well, maybe you don't.
No, I mean, I think it entirely depends on where you live. Where I live in Brookline, on Beacon Street, looking out my window at the beautiful fall leaves above the sea line track. There's no reason why I need to have a car. My wife needs one for her business, and we actually enjoy having one as a luxury. And I'm not going to apologize, or maybe I should apologize. I am sorry about my footprint in that regard, I guess. But it's a choice I've made, a selfish choice. We have a better life. We can afford a car, and we have one, but we certainly don't need one.
I want to change gears a little bit and think through with you how COVID impacts land use in urban areas. And I kind of don't want to talk about how it's impacting us right now. We can look around and see, hey, merchants finally said, please put something else in front of my storefront other than a parallel parking spot, as long as it's for my business, right? And we said, okay, we'll do that, right? And we took public space that we allow individuals to privatize, and we let the business privatize it. But it serves a general public good, and during COVID, we're thinking that's a good exchange. But how do you think urban areas are different in, say, 2025 because of what we've learned in the last 18 months and hopefully not too many more months to come?
Well, I mean, you've used the key word, which is learned. I think some cities are learning from COVID from their COVID experience, and others not as much. We saw some really interesting things happen with COVID. We saw, and this is something I'll be talking about in December when I have a keynote address to the state DOT. State DOTs all over America argue. I'm helping people fight a highway in Houston. They argue that when you reduce congestion, you make highways safer, and you make communities safer. One of the things we learned from COVID was that when congestion went down on our streets, fatalities went up, I think, 20% per driver? And now 2020 was like one of the worst years on record, and 2021 is doing worse than that. So one thing we learned is that is that reducing congestion is not a solution. Speeding people up is not a suggestion to making streets safer. That's one thing we learned. As you mentioned, a lot of communities, and not just in Boston and not just in Massachusetts, a lot of communities took advantage of that reduced traffic demand to dedicate parts of their roads to other uses. And some communities, particularly in Europe, were very straightforward about saying, we're doing this for COVID, but actually climate change is the real crisis. And we need to transform our cities. We need to take advantage of this breather to transform our cities in order to make them Green New Deal cities, if you want to call it that. I'm very curious to see how far Michelle Wu is able or willing to push that concept of what it means to be a green city. Anne Hidalgo, famously in Paris, and also Sadiq Khan in London, two mayors, really transformed their streetscapes. And in Paris, Anne Hidalgo is removing, half the parking spaces in the city. She's transforming hundreds of kilometers of streets into bikeways. And COVID was the trigger that allowed that to happen. Here in the US, you see a lot of streets that were closed, AKA open, to pedestrians and other uses. Many cities are opening those back up to cars. But in other places like Barcelona, you have the superblock system where in every 9-block grid, they've taken the 2 streets through the middle, imagine a tic-tac-toe board, and made those low volume, non-through streets. So different cities around the world are more or less aggressive about this. I think something as simple as sidewalk dining in a parklet, which I've been working with cities to do for decades now. I put the first parklets in Cedar Rapids, Iowa 10 years ago. And, there's no reason, the only reason to get rid of those is actually to encourage more driving by making the lanes, more ample. I think there's one thing I could communicate to your audience, if they haven't heard it yet, is that the evidence is absolutely clear that congestion is a constant, that there will be certain moments, times of day, and of course, pandemics and other things that cause our streets to not be crowded, but it is the equilibrium condition in any developed, busy, successful area to have exactly as much traffic as people are willing to put up with. Because the principal cost of driving to us, the principal cost we pay for driving is sitting in traffic. Therefore, as you provide more lanes, more people come. As you provide fewer lanes, fewer people come, or they find other ways to get around, like transit or cycling. We can have the kind of streets we want and have no more congestion. The congestion will ultimately find its level, which is exactly how much people are willing to tolerate at rush hour. And that's why these changes during COVID to remove it, like we did in Coolidge Corner, to turn a lane of driving into the parking lane and then turn the parking lane into a broader sidewalk, for example. Those are sort of things that I've been helping cities to do for decades now, but not just for COVID, but permanently. And they realize that it helps businesses. It doesn't hurt businesses to have fewer lanes of through traffic. And the final point I want to make, getting back to the Green New Deal, is that you can't truly be a Green New Deal city or even a Kyoto Accord city without saying we need to limit the amount of driving. And that's at the official level, at the mayoral level. That's something that Marty Walsh was willing to say. It's something I know that Michelle is going to say, that we have to limit the number of driving trips and get them onto other modes, into bikes and to buses and trains. The problem is that most city departments of transportation, including Boston's, are operating under the expectation that you cannot reduce the throughput of any major intersection. That's just a given. And how do I know it's a given? Because you have to do a traffic study before you do any development. And if your traffic study says that it's going to go from level D to level F or whatever, then the project is dead. So this idea that traffic studies, that are always wrong, by the way, but the idea that traffic studies are driving development means that you're not a green city. And so I think one of the first things Michelle Wu needs to do, and I'll tell her myself, is eliminate the traffic study as a tool for influencing development choices.
Lots to think about. Only unfortunately a few minutes for us to think about it. Hold your books up again. I want folks to know about them. And I know you've been reading another book, which I want you to hold up too,
So
with your third hand.
The other book I wanted to mention to you is this book I'm reading right now by a friend of mine, Chuck Marone, called Confessions of a Recovering Engineer. And this book is brand new. It's selling better than mine right now, but I still love it. And I'm actually the first blurb. And here's what I wrote. I've been waiting for this book for a long time. It's been more than a decade since its title essay rocked me to my core. Reading it was my Meg Ryan When Harry Met Sally moment. Over the intervening years, Chuck's message has become all the more necessary, and America may finally be ready for it. Chuck is an engineer. He realized that for a decade of his life, he was making communities more dangerous, killing people really, by imposing standard engineering criteria. The street design profession in the US grew out of the highway design profession with this presumption that a forgiving street is a safe street, that you remove friction, that you remove opportunities for collision, such as two-way traffic, such as cross streets, such as parallel parking, such as narrow lanes, such as trees, right? In Virginia, they call trees FHOs, fixed hazardous objects. So that concept, which is accurate for highways, which does make highways safer because the speed is set typically by people see the speed limit sign and then they set their cruise control 10 miles an hour over it. That's how the speed is set. In communities like ours, the speed at which people are driving is entirely a function of the cues that the environment is sending to the driver. Environment impacts behavior. And for that reason, we, not me, but we as a nation have been building roads for 50, 60 years with maximum forgiveness that creates the high speeds that kills pedestrians, kills drivers. And you know, the Vision Zero thing that you see having great success in Europe will not have success here until we accept this and we push through the natural conclusion from these arguments, which is we need to start building streets which are currently illegal, with narrower lanes, with tighter conditions, to set the design speed based on how fast you want people going in your community. Like, we don't want them going more than 20 through Coolidge Corner. So why can't we design a street that causes people to go 20, as opposed to the current rule, which is called the 85th percentile rule, which is you look at how fast people are going and you have to set the speed limit at a number in which 15% are speeding. It's insane. So the basic message of this book, Confessions of a Recovering Engineer, for those of you who really care about this space, is we need to fundamentally change the way we design streets in the US, and it's absolutely true.
Jeff, thanks for taking the time to be with us here on Brookline Interactive Group. I know you're so busy, but delighted that you could spend even a few minutes with us. And best of luck traveling around and helping folks figure out that everything old should be new again.
Thanks for letting me vent.
We'll see you soon.
Okay, bye, Tom.